The private room at the Chicago steakhouse smelled of aged leather and expensive cigars. I sat quietly in my faded tweed jacket and scuffed boots. Across the mahogany table, my Aunt Marion, my Uncle Silas, and my cousin Warren slid a thick white envelope toward me. Inside was a cashier's check for $20,000. The transaction was simple. Take the buyout and vanish from their lives forever. For 15 years, I had been the silent investor in their version of family. They took me in when I was 13, following the accident that left me an orphan. From day one, Marion and Silas made sure I knew my exact market value in their household. 0. I was the charity case, the burden, the low-class ward eating their food and taking up space in their immaculate Chicago estate. Tonight's dinner was ostensibly to celebrate Warren's new role as Executive Chief Operating Officer at Apex Innovations. He sat there, swirling a glass of scotch, acting like he had built the corporate conglomerate from the ground up. In reality, he was just a parasite feeding off a host. Apex Innovations belonged to my family. More accurately, it belonged to me. People might wonder why I stayed silent for so long, why I let them treat me like a servant in a house funded by my own bloodline. The truth is, psychological conditioning operates a lot like a long-term contract. When you are systematically isolated, diminished, and told you are worthless every single day for over a decade, you do not fight back immediately. You learn to endure. You develop the quiet, invisible chains of a survivor. They trained me to believe I had no power, no voice, and no resources. It wasn't weakness that kept me quiet. It was tactical endurance. I was gathering data. I was letting the statute of limitations on their arrogance run out while I quietly built my resilience. I sat at the table, concealing my true identity behind a mask of simple poverty. I let them see the frayed edges of my jacket. I let them look down on my job as a senior corporate accountant. They saw a math drone, someone who merely balanced the books. They had no idea I was the secret majority owner of the very empire they were looting. My inheritance had been placed in a private family trust, overseen by an executor, until I decided to claim it. I watched Marion adjust her diamond necklace, paid for by the dividends of my parents' life work. I listened to Silas boast about his golf handicap. I analyzed Warren's smug, self-satisfied grin. Anger wasn't loud this time. It was clinical. I rubbed my eyes, trying to summon regret or nostalgia for the family I never really had, but there was only clarity. This wasn't a breakdown. It was a balance sheet. The accounts had been in the red for 15 years. Tonight, it was time to collect the principal. "So, do we have a deal?" Warren asked, his voice dripping with bored condescension. He leaned back in his leather chair, crossing his arms. "You take the $20,000, and you agree to sever all ties. No phone calls. No showing up at the holidays. Mom and Dad have done enough for you." Marion offered a tight, practiced smile. "It is for the best, Clara. You have your accounting job now. You can afford a little apartment somewhere. We simply want to close this chapter and move forward." "Clean break," Silas added, tapping the table. "A solid severance package." I looked at the white envelope resting on the polished wood. They weren't shocked by what they were doing. They expected me to cry, to beg, to feel the crushing weight of their rejection. They expected me to negotiate the terms of my own exile. But the time for negotiations had expired. I didn't cry. I didn't ask why. I reached out and calmly picked up the envelope, sliding it into the pocket of my tweed jacket. It was evidence, a documented attempt at a buyout. The crisp paper felt heavy with their arrogance. "Excellent," Warren smirked, lifting his glass to take another sip of his expensive scotch. "I knew you would see reason. You always were practical when it came to a handout." I stood up. The movement was smooth, precise. I reached into my other pocket and pulled out a single, crumpled, $1 bill. I smoothed it out with my thumbs and placed it squarely on my porcelain bread plate. "For the tap water," I said. My voice was completely flat, devoid of any emotional fluctuation. Warren's smile faltered. Marion frowned, her perfectly arched eyebrows drawing together in confusion. "Clara, what are you doing?" she demanded. "Concluding the transaction," I replied. I didn't wait for their response. I didn't offer a dramatic farewell speech or a tearful goodbye. I simply turned and walked toward the heavy oak doors of the private dining room. I stepped out of the restaurant and into the freezing Chicago night. The bitter wind whipped against my face, but I didn't feel the cold. I felt absolute, unshakable control. The power reversal had already begun. They just didn't know it yet. I pulled my phone from my pocket, It was exactly 11:51 at night. I'd bypassed my contacts list and dialed a number I knew by heart. The phone rang exactly twice before a gravelly, familiar voice answered. "Stephen," I said, my breath pluming in the icy air. "Clara," my attorney replied. "It is late. Is everything all right?" "It is time," I told him. "The trial period is over. They just handed me a severance offer." There was a brief, sharp silence on the line, then a low chuckle. "I have been waiting for this call for 5 years. Give me the word." "Execute the trust," I ordered, my pace steady as I walked down the illuminated sidewalk. "And prepare the command center. I am on my way." I arrived at the towering glass skyscraper that served as the global headquarters for Apex Innovations at 12 o'clock midnight. The lobby was vast, silent, and lined with imported Italian marble. The night security guard, a man who usually demanded identification from anyone stepping past the velvet ropes, took one look at me and stepped aside. Stephen had already made the call. I bypassed the visitor desk completely and walked straight to the private executive elevator. I pressed my thumb against the biometric scanner. A soft green light flared, verifying my identity as the true majority shareholder. The heavy steel doors slid open, and the elevator whisked me up to the 52nd floor in absolute silence. When the doors parted, I stepped into the sprawling executive command center. I shed my faded tweed jacket, tossing it onto a sleek leather sofa. Standing by the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the glittering Chicago skyline was Stephen. In his 70s, he had been the lead corporate attorney for Apex Innovations for 30 years. He was the executor of my private trust, a ruthless, fiercely loyal legal architect who had guarded my family's legacy while I operated in the shadows. "Welcome home, Clara," Stephen said, turning to face me. He handed me a tablet loaded with financial dashboards. "Initiate an immediate, unsparing forensic audit of every executive account," I ordered, my eyes scanning the preliminary numbers. "I want a complete trace on Warren's authorizations, Marion's corporate cards, and Silas's vendor contracts. Leave nothing unchecked." Stephen nodded, his expression grim and satisfied. "My team is executing the final phase. We have monitored their irregularities for years, Clara. With your biometric override, we can finally access the offshore ledgers. They have been reckless, arrogant." It was true. As I reviewed the initial data streams, I saw the mechanics of their delusion. It is a psychological trap, the cruel normalization of corruption. When individuals like Warren, Marion, and Silas operate for years without facing consequences, they begin to view their theft not as a crime, but as an entitlement. They normalize their own deceit. They surround themselves with yes men, insulate themselves with corporate funds, and slowly rewrite their reality until they believe they are fundamentally untouchable. They thought the money belonged to them simply because they had unrestricted access to the accounts. They confused proximity to power with actual authority. They weren't shocked by what they had done, I murmured, watching the audit software begin its deep dive into the corporate treasury. They were shocked that I had stopped playing along. They thought my silence was stupidity. They thought my patience was submission. "They are about to receive a very harsh education in corporate governance," Stephen replied, pulling up a secondary display. "I have locked down all offshore transfers. By morning, we will have a complete map of their embezzlement." "What are your parameters for the investigation?" "There are no parameters," I stated, tapping the glass screen to authorize the full system override. "I do not want them reprimanded. I want them dismantled, audit every penny, track every wire transfer. We are going to bleed their fraudulent empire dry, and we are going to do it by the book." For 48 hours, the 52nd floor functioned as a war room. Stephen's elite team of forensic accountants tore through the Apex Innovations ledgers with surgical precision. I barely slept. I didn't need to. Every newly decrypted file, every uncovered wire transfer fueled my focus. This wasn't revenge. It was accounting. The scale of their embezzlement was staggering. The audit mapped a massive, systemic scheme of corporate looting. Warren had systematically routed millions of dollars from the corporate treasury into a web of offshore shell companies. He had used company capital to finance an 80-foot luxury yacht registered in the Cayman Islands. Marion and Silas had treated the enterprise like a personal slush fund, expensing hundreds of thousands of dollars on custom wardrobes, private jet charters, and country club memberships. They had bled the company's operational reserves dry to maintain their high society facade. I watched the deficit numbers climb on the main monitor. They had treated my inheritance like an endless subscription, and I had been the one silently footing the bill. On the second afternoon, my phone rang. It was Warren. I let it ring 3 times before answering. "Clara," he barked, his voice laced with forced authority. "We need to finalize your exit. I have paperwork for you to sign. Come down to my office immediately." "I will be right there," I replied, keeping my voice entirely devoid of inflection. I took the elevator down to the 45th floor and walked into his lavish corner office. Warren was sitting behind a massive mahogany desk, looking incredibly pleased with himself. He slid a legal document across the polished surface. "This is a non-disclosure and severance agreement," Warren stated, tapping the paper. "It guarantees your $20,000 payout. In exchange, you sign away any theoretical rights to the family estate or Apex Innovations. You also agree to absolute silence. If you refuse, I will personally ensure you are blacklisted from every accounting firm in the Midwest. You will be completely isolated." He was trying to extort me. He was threatening my livelihood to protect his stolen throne. I picked up the document. I read the clauses. Warren had actually documented his attempt to illegally force a shareholder out of the company, using company funds as a bribe, and leveraging corporate influence as a threat. He had formalized his own crime on company letterhead. I didn't pick up a pen. Instead, I calmly folded the document and slid it into the inside pocket of my jacket. "What do you think you're doing?" Warren snapped, his smug expression faltering. "Sign the paper, Clara." "I will need to review these terms carefully before signing anything," I replied, my voice completely flat. "I understand my place perfectly." I stood up and smoothed my jacket. I didn't tell him that by handing me this drafted extortion attempt, he had just given Stephen the final piece of written evidence required for a federal indictment. I just turned and walked out of the office, heading back to the 52nd floor. The trap was set, and Warren had locked himself inside it. The annual Apex Innovations Corporate Merger Gala was the crown jewel of Chicago's high society calendar. Held in the grand ballroom of the city's most exclusive hotel, the room was a sea of crystal chandeliers, flowing champagne, and elite investors. Warren, Marion, and Silas held court near the main stage, basking in the glow of stolen prestige. They were celebrating a merger that Warren believed would cement his legacy as chief executive officer. At exactly 8 o'clock, the orchestra music faded as the scheduled mandatory shareholder meeting commenced. Warren stepped up to the podium, tapping the microphone with a practiced, arrogant smile. "Ladies and gentlemen, shareholders and esteemed guests," Warren began, his voice echoing across the ballroom. "Tonight, we celebrate the future of Apex Innovations." He didn't get to finish his sentence. I stepped through the heavy mahogany doors at the back of the ballroom. I was no longer wearing the faded tweed jacket or scuffed boots. I wore a bespoke midnight blue suit, sharply tailored, projecting absolute authority. The room fell entirely silent as I walked down the center aisle, my heels clicking rhythmically against the polished marble floor. Stephen walked half a pace behind me, carrying a sleek leather briefcase. "Clara?" Marion gasped from the front table, her champagne flute trembling. "What on earth are you doing here?" "Security," Warren snapped into the microphone. "Remove her immediately." The security guards lining the walls didn't move an inch. Stephen had already briefed the head of corporate security and showed them the legal injunction. They no longer answered to Warren. I reached the stage, bypassed Warren completely, and plugged a secure flash drive into the main presentation console. "I am exercising my right as the owner of 78% of Apex Innovations to address this shareholder assembly," I stated, my voice ringing out cold and clear through the sound system. I hit a button on the console. The enormous digital screens flanking the stage flickered to life. Instead of merger projections, the screens displayed the results of our 52nd floor forensic audit. Bank statements, offshore routing numbers, images of the 80-foot Cayman yacht, and the drafted extortion contract illuminated the ballroom in harsh, unforgiving high definition. For the past 5 years, the current executive team has engaged in systematic corporate embezzlement, I announced to the stunned crowd. Millions of dollars have been illegally diverted from the company treasury to fund private luxury assets and personal accounts. Warren's face drained of color. He lunged for the console, but Stephen stepped effortlessly into his path. Silas stood up, his mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. Marion slumped back into her chair, a hand flying to her mouth. "They thought power was an entitlement," I continued, my gaze locking onto Warren's panicked eyes. But this is not a family dinner. This is a balance sheet, and the accounts have been reconciled. The heavy doors at the back of the ballroom swung open again. A team of federal agents from the Financial Crimes Division marched into the room, their badges gleaming under the chandeliers. They moved directly toward the stage, handcuffs already unclipped. The execution was clinical, public, and absolute. 6 months later, the dust had fully settled on the ruins of their fraudulent empire. The justice system was as methodical as a corporate audit. Warren was convicted of multiple counts of wire fraud and extortion. He was currently serving a 10-year sentence in a federal penitentiary. Stripped of their stolen corporate assets and crippled by massive legal fees, Marion and Silas faced total financial ruin. They were evicted from their sprawling estate and forced into a cramped, unheated apartment on the outskirts of the city, drowning under a pile of unpaid utility bills. Their downfall was swift, and the mechanics of their collapse were entirely psychological. It was the illusion of power of an empty wallet. They had confused what they possessed with who they actually were. Their entire identity, their arrogance, and their supposed superiority were merely rented properties, funded by a stolen bank account. They had no internal value, no genuine resilience, and no actual competence. When the money vanished, their entire sense of self disintegrated. Without the corporate credit cards and the luxury yachts to shield them, they collapsed into nothing. They had built their lives on an illusion, and the reality of their own emptiness crushed them. I, on the other hand, sat quietly on the wooden front porch of my modest suburban home. I held a chipped ceramic mug of dark roast coffee, letting the warmth seep into my hands. Apex Innovations was thriving under new, ethical leadership. The balance sheets were clean. The bleeding had stopped. I watched the early morning sunrise paint the sky in shades of gold and pale purple. The neighborhood was quiet, the air crisp and still. I've come to realize that holding on to anger is like keeping a toxic asset on your ledger. It only depreciates your own value. I didn't dismantle their lives out of malice. I simply stopped subsidizing their cruelty. Forgiveness isn't always for the other person. Sometimes, it's the only way to set yourself free from the debt of their actions. True peace doesn't come from watching those who hurt you fall. It comes from knowing you are finally safe, secure, and entirely in control of your own destiny. I had balanced the scales, and now the ledger of my life was finally my own to write. If this story of quiet resilience, uncompromising boundaries, and ultimate justice resonated with you, drop a like, share your thoughts in the comments below, and let us know where you are watching from today. Hit subscribe for more stories that prove arrogance always pays a heavy price.